Hello, I'm Nicole Goche from the University of Kentucky. I'm an extension plant pathologist, and today we're going to take a deep dive into Neopestalotiopsis disease, which is a new disease in strawberry, not really new to the US, but definitely new for Kentucky in 2024-2025 growing season. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to take a look at some of the management practices at stake. So here we go. So Neopestalotiopsis, that's the name of the pathogen, and that is the name of the disease. So I know that's a mouthful. Neopestalotiopsis can be shortened to Neopest. So that's what we call it on a day-to-day basis, and every pathologist will understand what you're talking about if you say Neopest. So I kind of alluded to earlier that Neopest is a new-ish disease to the US. It was discovered in Florida during the 2018 growing season. And very quickly it spread across Florida, across the Southeast. And here it is in 2024 in August, as a matter of fact, it made its way into Kentucky, into the plastic culture strawberry world. So regardless of where it is along the eastern seaboard and up into eastern Canada, a couple of things ring true is that it spreads very rapidly. The disease spreads very rapidly, particularly when weather is rainy. So when there's persistent water available to plants and to the pathogen, of course, for 48 hours or so. As a result, this disease causes very high plant losses and then, of course, high fruit losses. No cultivars have been shown to be resistant, even though we see some tolerance out there. But one thing is for sure, no matter where we are, is this disease is difficult to manage. So high losses, difficult managing. So let's take a look at some symptoms. In general, Neopest causes symptoms on leaves, crowns, and roots, and fruit. So we're going to take a little bit of a look. We're going to talk about some specifics of those symptoms. So first, leaf diseases. This is the first thing we notice, and pretty much any plant disease. We notice leaf symptoms first with most diseases. With Neopest, symptoms begin on the older leaves, so the inner crown, that lower crown part, and in general, those leaves, they're older, and then, of course, they're closer to the ground where there's more moisture, they're better protected, and the humidity in that little canopy is a lot higher. Spots begin as circular and then become kind of irregular. And when there's a lot of spots on a single leaf, they start to coalesce, so they start to join together. Spots can range anywhere from dark to light, and they're generally scattered across the leaf. When those symptoms, when those spots are near the margin of the leaf, they tend to take on a V shape. So if you look at that leaf all the way to the left, kind of taking on that V-shaped lesion, that's pretty indicative of a spot that kind of starts on that margin. And in general, especially when it's really wet, when we have persistent rains, we'll see a cervuli developing in the centers of those spots where it becomes tan, and a cervuli are simply fruiting structures that include spore masses. So a cervuli will look like shiny black pepper flakes, again, in the center of those lesions, usually where it turns tan in that older spot. And one tricky thing about Neopest is with leaf symptoms, it looks a lot like a lot of other leaf diseases we see in strawberry. Phomopsis leaf spot, common leaf spot, strawberry leaf scorch, and strawberry leaf blotch. So they all look pretty similar at different stages of disease development, which makes it really hard to diagnose by eye by symptoms. Secondly, and perhaps the most destructive part of this disease, is when it infects fruit. So fruit disease symptoms will start as light tan, irregular, so that means they're not perfectly round, and sunken lesion. So the sunken part, that's kind of a big deal a lot of times when we're looking. Very quickly, this disease will take over the entire fruit. And guess what? Look in the center. We'll see those acervuli again. those cervuli, remember, those are kind of fruiting structures. They look like shiny black pepper flakes. We see a lot more of these cervuli during the rainy or these persistent rains, persistently wet conditions. Neopest disease on strawberry fruit looks a lot like anthracnose fruit rot. So again, look-alike diseases, which makes this a little bit harder to diagnose there in the field. And finally, let's take a look at some crown symptoms. So when crowns become infected, they will cause necrosis in that crown, affect nutrient and water uptake into the leaves and into the terrestrial part of the plant. So reddening of those older leaves, stunted new leaves, eventually plant death. If you look at the crown, if you take a cross section of that crown, orange to brown necrosis in that crown, which looks a lot like what? Anthracnose crown rot, right? So again, another lookalike, but disease basically, or the pathogen basically moves from the leaves down those petioles and into that crown, and eventually can keep moving. It can get into those roots and cause a root rot. And rotten roots are, guess what? They're dark brown to black, they're collapsing. So a typical rot in those roots. So we're having movement from leaves to crowns to roots. Eventually, like I said, plants will die. They cannot be restricted from water and nutrients, and entire plants will die. Those crown rot and root rot symptoms are more common during the fruiting phase of the plant, so during the reproductive phase, but it can happen at any time. Like I said a second ago, Neopest crown rot symptoms look a lot like anthracnose crown rot, especially when you take a horizontal slice or a cross section out of that crown. So what is Neopestalotiopsis? What is this mouthful of a pathogen here? Neopestalotiopsis is the genus of this pathogen. The species at this point is not known. So usually when pathologists will discover a new pathogen, it takes some time to go through the taxonomy and to properly label it. So right now that process is happening. So right now we're calling it just Neopestalotiopsis by its genus. So hopefully we'll have a species name, but whether we have that species name or not, it doesn't really affect how we manage this disease, right? So Neopestalotiopsis is the name of the pathogen. We're still going to call the disease Neopest just to make it easier for us. So initially, when Neopest was discovered, the idea that it was a Pestalotia species, and Pestalotia is very closely related, but Pestalotia pathogens are more secondary pathogens. We call them opportunistic. So they'll only infect when there's a weak plant or a damaged plant or a wounded plant. So it wasn't Pestalotia, but it's close to that one. So let's say they're cousins, just for the lack of a better term. Our Neopestalotiopsis on strawberry, however, is a new species and it's very aggressive. So it's not passive, it's not opportunistic like its cousin Pestalotia. Neopestalotiopsis infects strawberry primarily. It causes disease on strawberry. At this point, we only know that it causes disease on strawberry, but it is known to infect some weeds, not causing symptoms. We call that asymptomatic. So not causing symptoms in those weeds, but infecting. So some weeds may be serving as reservoir hosts in fields, and there's more research going on there. So I'll update everyone once we know a little bit more. In general, Neopestalotiopsis is primarily or almost exclusively a strawberry disease. So introducing it into fields through plugs, being imported from areas where there is disease. And then once it appears in a field, it can spread by rain or water splash, by workers' shoes, tools, wet hands, equipment. So small scale spread, but definitely the ability to spread from field to field within a site. But when it's introduced onto the farm, it's coming in most of the time in plugs. Okay, so let's take a look at what this pathogen needs in order to complete its life cycle to produce those spores that infect clean plants. I said this earlier, prolonged leaf wetness. So once the pathogen is there and it gets 48 hours or more of leaf wetness. So that's usually those drizzly rains that we see here in Kentucky in the springtime. That's when it's going to start producing lots of spores and spreading. So 48 hours of prolonged leaf wetness, usually coming in terms of consecutive rain events. Again, this is Kentucky. Spring is rainy most of the time. Ideally, conditions between 60 degrees and 78 degrees are optimal for sporulation and infection, but the pathogen can be active at as low as 50 degrees, high as 86 degrees. So you won't get as many sporulation cycles, but all the same, you can still have that active pathogen. So think about that. That 50 degrees is when we're going to start thinking about managing disease up until 86. And again, here in Kentucky, we've pretty much harvested and removed all of our plastic culture strawberries by then. In the fall, when we're planting, we really are not beyond that 86 degrees Fahrenheit temperature, right? So we're always, let's say always within that active range, but that optimal range, 60 to 78 degrees and rainy. So think about that as we go through here. One of the concerns we also have to always be thinking about is overwintering, or in our case, oversummering. How does this pathogen survive from season to season in a strawberry field? We know that Neopestalotiopsis will overwinter in debris, so that would be the strawberry debris. All of those leaves that have decomposed or started to decompose, fallen off of plants, and are sitting in the field, that pathogen is still on those old disease leaves, even though they're starting to decay. And then, of course, they make their way into the soil, whether it's in leaf pieces or strawberry crown or root pieces, or if they're loose. Cold temperatures in general will help the fungus survive. So don't think that because this is a cold winter, we had a cold spell, that the fungus will die. In fact, just the opposite. So a cold weather is more of a preservative in general for fungal pathogens. The pathogen, those spores, will survive about 6 months on the surface, on debris, on the surface. So think about the time between springtime and harvest when we might have disease to the time we plant another strawberry crop, if in fact we do plant another one in the same field. So survival 6 months on the surface in debris, and then of course as it is buried, it is protected more. It can survive a lot longer in buried debris. In Florida, one of my colleagues told me that they have confirmed survival for at least 18 months in the extreme Florida heat, and they think that it's surviving much longer. So again, more of that data coming out. I will update all of our growers as soon as we have that in our hands. One thing they do in the far extreme southeast that we don't really do here in Kentucky is fumigate. And the data is showing us, though, that fumigation at the large scale is in the rows, not between the rows. So even if fumigation works well, so nothing's 100%, but even if it works well, those row middles are not getting fumigated. So that pathogen is still there in those fields. All right. So this is what we're all here for, right? Management. How do we manage this disease? How do we manage this pathogen? Two ways in general. Every plant disease, we manage it in two ways. We exclude it. So we keep it from coming in the first place. And then once it's there, we make an attempt towards eradication. So we never completely eradicate, but we make some attempts to suppress, to reduce, and to manage once that pathogen enters our field. So think about it from those two aspects, and we'll take a little closer look at each of those. So starting with exclusion, keep it out. Don't let this pathogen in your field. Easier said than done. It was a tough year in 2024. Growers really had challenges getting their hands on clean plugs, but never, ever introduce new pathogens into your field knowingly. So examine all plugs before they make it onto your farm, and if there's any suspicious plugs at all, reject that load. Do not put them in the field. So again, being able to examine those plants and take it very seriously. Be very cautious when moving plants between fields. So maybe you had a field that was infected last year or this current year, but how do you keep it out of the adjacent field or maybe a field or zone across the farm? So think about long distance movement or short distance movement across a field. Always plant in or think and plan in blocks and zones. So if there is an outbreak in a block or a zone or a small field, that you're not moving it into the next field. And remember how I told you how we are moving this pathogen. Once it's here, we're moving it in debris and soil and plant matter. So think about that as you're moving from field to field. And most importantly, when it comes to introducing or not introducing this pathogen into your farm, is don't think that fungicides can cure Neopestalotiopsis. Fungicides are not curative. We use the word curative way too loosely a lot of times. Fungicides don't cure. They're suppressants, they're only temporary, and they're not going to cure disease. So to think that you can purchase or introduce disease plants or disease plugs onto your farm and use fungicides to stop it is a misnomer. That's not going to happen. Fungicides do not cure disease. All right, part 2 of disease management is eradication. So eradicate, not what we're doing. Again, it's a word we use. In theory, we would love to eradicate a pathogen once it makes its way onto our farm, but instead we're trying to reduce and we're trying to suppress, okay, so it's not spreading. So that attempt toward eradication means removing all diseased plants and destroying them immediately before spread can continue. So we're going to first turn off that faucet to stop the bleeding. We're going to stop any new sporulation, get rid of diseased plants. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Not leave those plants in the field, not take our chances, not think that applying fungicides to badly diseased plants is going to get us any further. After we remove plants, we're going to deep till. Ideally, we're going to deep till before we plant or before we make our rows and bed our fields. And then again, we're going to deep till after the growing season. So we're burying that debris as deeply as we can to promote decomposition of that debris. We're always trying to rotate on a 3-year basis. So that is specialty crops 101. 3-year rotations in all of our farms, even in our vegetable gardens or our flower gardens. Rotations will help us break disease cycles. So I would love to see all of our strawberry growers here in Kentucky rotate on a 3-year basis. But skipping a year at the very least. So a 2-year rotation is better than nothing at all. Remember that 6 to 18 month survival of those propagules, right, in the field. If we have a risk of Neopestalotiopsis, maybe we know a lot of our neighbors have it and we haven't seen it yet, but we want to protect, we're going to use fungicides as preventatives. So protecting healthy plants, protecting healthy tissue so that if a fungal spore does land, then it won't be able to infect. If you have low levels of infection, using fungicides as suppressants. Now, of course, that's always dependent on the weather. That's always dependent on so many factors, not just the best fungicides out there. So we can try to use fungicides as suppressants. Sometimes that works. Sometimes that doesn't work. And of course, that's besides thinking about the overwintering and the long-term contamination of a farm, it's also a dollars and cents issue. So thinking about it that way. And again, if you have disease, don't expect fungicides to cure. Okay, I'm going to say that multiple times today. Fungicides do not cure disease, so don't think that that is going to be the solution. All right, speaking of fungicides, right, that's what we're all here to talk about, that fungicides really do work magic, right? Even with a disease like this, fungicides do a lot to protect our crop, to suppress disease. So let's think about the fungicides that we know are effective against Neopestalotiopsis and are labeled for strawberry. In general, there are 3 fungicides that are recommended for strawberries, for Neopestalotiopsis disease on strawberry. The first one is Thyram SC, and that's an M-class multi-site inhibitor, FRAC code. The label of Thyram SC says that we can apply 12 applications per season. Now, not per calendar year, so you don't get 12 applications in the fall and 12 applications in the spring. There are 12 applications for your crop from the time of planting to the time of harvest. I'm sure growers have heard a lot of buzz that the EPA is going to be restricting Thyram in the near future. What we expect is there may be some restrictions on things like seed treatments, additional PPE, and environmental protections. I don't think we're going to lose Thyram, but we may see some more restrictions. We may lose a number of applications, or the label may state a lower rate. But right now, I don't think we're losing Thyram. Our second fungicide is Switch. Switch is a premix of FRAC 12 and a FRAC 9. Switch's label says that we can apply 5 applications per season or per crop, and Switch is also labeled as a pre-plant dip. And the third, I say fungicide, the third class of fungicides, the FRAC 3s, there are 3 fungicides in that class. So you're not going to use all 3. So if you're rotating, you're going to pick one. And those choices are Rhyme, Tilt, and Inspire. And you can have up to 4 applications per cropping season with these FRAC 3s. And if you have just a generic propiconazole product, there may be less than 4 applications allowed on the label. So those are restrictions. Those are the parameters that we're talking in. And then in terms of a spray schedule, in general, we are beginning as soon after transplant, and we're applying at 10 to 14-day intervals as long as we're in that active zone, right? So we can stretch that interval out when we're cooler, and then as we get into those optimal conditions, those optimal temperatures, and definitely that rainy weather, we want that interval to be shorter. A couple of other notes. I know a lot of growers have asked me these things. So my counterparts in Florida, the ones who have done the most of the work on this disease, on Neopestalotiopsis, have tested many different fungicides, including Omega 500 and Bravo Weather Stick. And both of those look really good on some of that data that's floating around the internet. So our growers here in Kentucky have asked a lot about those. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. Omega 500, there is a registration in process, so we may be seeing that label this year or next, but that is for nursery production only. We're not going to see Omega 500 label for the fields in the near future. And then Bravo Weather Stick, it is not registered. I don't think there's any plans to register it. There's another chlorothalonil product on the market, Echo 720. It is labeled in California, only in California, and it is labeled for non-bearing strawberry. So I don't think either one of those is going to be a solution for our field strawberry here in Kentucky anytime soon. All right, so speaking of my colleagues in Florida and the Southeast who've done a lot of work, there have been a lot of products they've tested. So if you find that data online, you see what's not effective. You see some of the big ones, Kenja, Metal, Procure, Thompson. Those are not effective against Neopestalotiopsis. They're wonderful products. They're not the solution for this disease. They've also tested some biologicals in those studies, and I have some listed here that have not been effective. Armory, Quava, Howler, Oso, Oxidate, Problad, Silmatrix, and Warhammer. Not effective at the way they were tested and the way those studies were designed. So there may be new data coming out in the future, but the way these products were tested alone, they did not work against Neopest. Okay. So I put together some fungicide schedules for Kentucky growers. So anybody watching this that does not grow in Kentucky, please keep in mind that these spray schedules were built for the length of our season and our climate. Okay, so the time that we plant, the time that we cover our plastic culture strawberries, the time that we uncover in the spring, time that we harvest. This is our window. So if you are not from Kentucky and you are watching this, please contact your local extension office to get something more appropriate for your area, for your climate. Okay, so fungicide spray schedule for high risk strawberry. What is high risk? That is a little bit relative, but if you had infected plants that you've removed, if an adjacent field has disease, if you had infected plugs and you planted them anyway, I hope you did not, that's what I'm calling high risk. So that spray schedule is going to look a little bit like this. In the fall, you start with Thiram, and then you're going to start combining Thiram with some of those other products with Switch or Rime Inspire. That means Rime or Inspire, right? That's that frac 3. Then back to Rime and Switch, back to Thiram and Switch, then Thiram plus Rime or Inspire, and Thiram. So you're going to do that until it gets cold, below 50 degrees. You're going to cover your strawberries for the winter. When those row covers come off, that's going to be kind of dependent, right? That's when our temperatures fluctuate up and down in early spring here in Kentucky. So you'll do a couple of applications of Thiram until we start getting into those optimal temperatures again, and you're going to start that tank mix. So Thiram plus something else. And if you look at this, so I've kept in mind here our maximum number of applications of each of these products. So we cannot apply anymore. So this is our high risk strawberry, and this is our heaviest fungicide application. So right, this is a rescue treatment, if you will. Now, if you don't think your risk is that high, you have a moderate risk, but you still want to be really proactive. You don't want to risk losing your strawberry crop this year. Then I'm calling that a moderate risk. And basically, we're not tank mixing. So we're rotating Thiram with Switch or Rime. And I'm saying Rime here. That means Rime or Inspire. And same thing, we're stopping at about 6 applications in the fall, and we're starting again in the spring when we uncover and things start to warm up. And I think we'll get about 6 applications in the field, both in the spring and in the fall. The season may drag on longer, the season may be shorter. This is my guess based on our Kentucky climate and our typical production system. All right, organic growers, I did not leave you out. Our research partners, our collaborators, my counterparts in the Southeast have looked at some organic products. Remember, I showed you which ones did not work. The best organic products that were out there were Serenade Opti, which is a Bacillus subtilis, and Actigard. I know Actigard is not Omni approved. We have a lot of growers here in Kentucky who follow organic practices but are not Omni certified, and they are willing to use Actigard. So Actigard, I'm lumping in there with the organic or the softer chemistries. So those are the two that did the best in these research tests over the last several years. But based on that, based on what we know, some of my guesses, if you are an organic grower and you need some additional products, I think these could be potential products, and we plan on testing these here in Kentucky in the near future. First of all, it's other Bacillus products, and that could be C, Stargus, double nickel. Remember, though, that not all Bacillus products are the same, so there are different Bacillus species and then different strains depending on the brand. There are also botanical or biological or softer products that induce an immune response. We call those SAR, systemic acquired resistance. So our SAR products that probably have some efficacy and could probably be combined with some other products include Regalia, EcoSwing, or Lifeguard. And again, these are just my guesses. I am throwing some things out here so maybe we can protect our crops as much as possible. And hopefully we'll have solid data in the future. The spray schedule for organic growers or for some of these biologicals is the products have to be applied as preventative. So beginning those sprays as soon as strawberry are transplanted, applying at 7 to 10 day intervals as long as conditions are over 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so in summary, how do we manage Neopest disease in strawberry in Kentucky or anywhere? We're starting with clean plants. We're rotating our crops at least 2 years. So we're at least skipping a year in each field 3 to 4 years in fields with a history of disease. So I can hear the gasps from this virtual presentation, but as much as you can rotate out, the better. Always avoid moving soil and debris from field to field or from zone to zone. Think about your tires on your tractors. Think about your shoes. Think about your clothing. Think about those things. Always work in your clean fields first before moving on to dirty fields. Never do it the other way because you risk bringing some of those spores from an infected field to a clean field. And then, of course, we're using fungicides ideally as preventative. So we're protecting healthy plants as opposed to waiting for infection to occur and trying to rescue, because that often does not work, or the cost of the products is much higher than the yield that you may get. So putting the pen to paper, a lot of times it's not worth it. So use fungicides as preventatives. All right, just a couple of closing comments. Even in the best situations, if we have rainy conditions like we usually do in Kentucky in the springtime, fungicides are likely to only be about 50% effective. So only rescuing 50% of your plants or 50% of your harvest. So keep that number in mind as you start to plan. Fumigation, it's really not happening here in Kentucky. Our growers are small. Fumigation is expensive, and a lot of our fumigation companies are not going into small fields. Also, fumigation is not 100% effective because we're not fumigating between rows. And finally, I'm saying it again, fungicides do not cure plant diseases. Do not ever buy infected plants and think you're going to cure them. Okay. So in closing, I just want to remind all of our viewers about some of our resources. First of all, the Department of Plant Pathology's website, and that is plantpathology.ca, that means College of Agriculture, plantpathology.ca.uky.edu, and I'll have all those links down in the description. If you go to that website, you'll see we have a Neopestalotiopsis disease or Neopest disease of strawberry fact sheet on that page. And we also have lots of other resources, including spray guides, and there's our anthracnose. So we have some other strawberry and fruit disease fact sheets, as well as lots of other crops. So check out that website. And finally, other resources. First and foremost is your local county extension office. Your county agent can help you with a lot of things, accessing resources, accessing the plant disease diagnostic lab if that's what you need. Your county agent is there for you. There's a county office in every county in Kentucky, 120 of them, and your county agent will help you with that. And then finally, lots of social media. I know we're all on social media these days. So my handles are at KY Plant Disease. You can find me on all of the major social media sites. And again, I'll have those links down in the description. So with that, thank you very much. I look forward to meeting all of our strawberry growers here in Kentucky, but let's hope you're not calling with a Neopest question. So thanks again and have a good night.